There are places on this planet that do not fully belong to the domain of the human. Zones where the scale of natural forces reduces any work of engineering to an almost comical insignificance. Where the climate acts with such brutal autonomy that the most sophisticated navigation instruments become little more than psychological comfort. The Bering Sea is one of those places, possibly the most extreme of all. To understand why this specific body of water at the northwestern edge of the Pacific Ocean has accumulated such a formidable reputation among those who work on it, it is necessary to abandon for a moment any mental image of a temperate ocean or picturesque seas. The Bering Sea is none of those things. It is, in statistical terms, the most dangerous body of water on the planet for those who work on it, and the reasons why it holds that title involve a combination of geography, meteorology, oceanography, and biology that seems almost designed to punish the human beings who dare to venture into its waters. The scene described by Jonathan Hillstrand, one of the most experienced captains of the Bering fishing fleet, in the memoirs he wrote with his brother Andy, captures with brutal precision what it means to be in that sea. Water cold enough to kill a man in 5 minutes, winds of up to 120 knots, waves exceeding 30 meters, and a mass of Arctic ice advancing from Russia with the relentlessness of a living glacier, capable of wrapping the steel hull of a working vessel as if it were paper. All of this in an environment where the nearest help may be hours away, where a distress signal may take too long to be answered, and where the margin between routine work and fatal catastrophe is measured in seconds. Understanding the Bering Sea requires beginning with its geographic anatomy, because the shape of this sea largely explains its meteorological behavior. It covers an area of approximately 2.3 million square kilometers, making it one of the largest seas on the planet. It is bordered to the north by the Bering Strait, that narrow strip of water barely 85 kilometers wide that separates Alaska from Siberia, and that, during the Pleistocene glaciations, was solid land across which the first human beings crossed from Asia into America. To the south, the chain of the Aleutian Islands delimits it with a series of volcanic arcs that function, in meteorological terms, as a partial wall, high enough to concentrate and amplify storm systems, insufficient to block them. This geographic configuration creates what meteorologists call a pressure funnel. The barometric depressions that form over the North Pacific, some of the deepest and most energetic in the Northern Hemisphere, find in the Bering an ideal territory to intensify before colliding with Arctic air masses descending from the north. The result of that collision is a succession of storms that, unlike tropical hurricanes or extratropical cyclones of the North Atlantic, do not have clearly defined seasons. In the Bering, severe storms are possible during virtually any month of the year, although they reach their greatest frequency and intensity between October and March, which is precisely when the fishing fleet operates most intensively. What distinguishes the Bering from other equally dangerous ocean regions, such as Cape Horn or the Drake Passage, is the combination of that storm regime with its particular shallow water geography. Unlike the Drake, which is an open ocean of great depth where waves can travel thousands of kilometers and develop relatively predictable regularity, the Bering is a semi-enclosed sea with a continental shelf that can be less than 100 meters deep over large expanses. When storms generate swell over shallow waters, the waves cannot develop the wavelength they would have in deep water. The seabed slows and compresses them, increasing their steepness and making them shorter, more abrupt, and more likely to break over vessels. An experienced sailor in the North Atlantic may feel that he knows how to read the sea. A sailor arriving in the Bering for the first time often discovers that this knowledge does not transfer directly because the behavior of the waves is qualitatively different. The temperature of the water in the Bering Sea in winter ranges between -1.8 degrees Celsius, which is the freezing point of salt water, and 4 degrees. To put this into physiological terms, a human being who falls into water at those temperatures without adequate protection loses muscular coordination within minutes, experiences incapacitation of the respiratory muscles between 2 and 7 minutes, and reaches unconsciousness between 30 minutes and 1 hour. Death from hypothermia may occur between 30 minutes and 90 hours, depending on the exact water temperature, the physical constitution of the individual, and whether or not they are wearing a survival suit. Without that suit, the times are brutally shorter. What makes this reality especially terrifying in the context of the Bering is that cold water is not the only danger. It is the final danger, the conclusion of a chain of events that begins long before anyone falls into the sea. The usual sequence of a tragedy in the Bering does not begin with someone falling overboard. It begins with the wind. Williwaws are one of the most specific and most feared meteorological phenomena of the Bering and of the entire Aleutian Arc. The name, of uncertain origin, refers to extremely violent and sudden gusts of wind that descend from the walls of fjords and mountain slopes toward the waters. Unlike the sustained wind of a conventional storm, a williwaw can appear with only minutes of warning, reach speeds of 130 kilometers per hour in seconds, and disappear just as quickly, without giving crew or captain time to react appropriately. In the worst documented conditions, williwaws of up to 210 kilometers per hour have been recorded, speeds that fall within the range of a Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale, but with the added disadvantage that they occur without the extended warning that tropical hurricanes usually provide. When a williwaw strikes a fishing vessel, the effects are immediate and severe. Fishermen working on deck can literally be swept off their feet. The water, lifted by the wind, forms a mixture of foam and horizontal rain that reduces visibility to virtually zero. And above all, wind speed interacts with the state of the sea to generate waves that within minutes can go from manageable to catastrophic. The Beaufort scale, which describes sea states as a function of wind speed, reaches a maximum of force 12, corresponding to a situation in which the sea is completely white with foam and visibility is severely compromised by spray and suspended water particles. In the Bering, force 12 is not a statistical curiosity. Fishermen who have worked there for years, like the Hillstrand brothers, describe force 8, which corresponds to waves between 5 and 7 meters with winds between 60 and 70 kilometers per hour, as their routine working condition. Force 10, with waves between 9 and 12 meters, is something that happens from time to time. Force 12 is something they have encountered more than once. What makes those waves especially dangerous is not only their height, but their dynamic behavior. Bering waves are generally shorter and steeper than those of open and warmer oceans, which means they have a greater tendency to break directly over vessels rather than lift them and let them descend. A wave that breaks over the deck of a fishing vessel transfers enormous force in a very short time, enough to sweep away any equipment that is not firmly secured, to open portholes and hatches that are not perfectly sealed, and to destabilize any person who does not have both hands gripping something solid. There is also a special category of waves that inspires fear even among the most seasoned Bering fishermen: rogue waves. For decades, sailors' accounts of impossibly large waves emerging from relatively calm seas to swallow vessels without warning were dismissed as exaggerations or nautical folklore. It was not until the 1990s, with the advent of systematic satellite monitoring of the oceans, that oceanographers began to document that these waves do indeed exist, that they can reach heights of 30 meters or more under conditions that conventional mathematical models considered practically impossible, and that the Bering Sea presents particularly favorable conditions for their formation. A rogue wave is, in essence, the result of the constructive superposition of several wave trains that converge at the same point at the same time. In the Bering, where ocean currents, tides, and winds can generate multiple wave trains in different directions simultaneously, that convergence is statistically more likely than in other parts of the ocean. Jonathan Hillstrand described directly what it means to take the impact of such a wave aboard the Time Bandit, a mass of water 30 meters high, with a 10-meter white crest falling onto the vessel from the stern. The impact throwing the captain against the ceiling of the wheelhouse, the microwave torn from its mounts, crashing through the galley door, the refrigerator sliding from wall to wall. The vessel was pushed several meters below the surface before recovering. The entire crew, gathered in silence in the wheelhouse as the boat trembled, thought they had reached the end. If wind and waves represent the most dramatic and cinematic danger of the Bering, ice is the most treacherous, the one that acts more stealthily and with potentially more devastating consequences. There are two main types of ice that threaten vessels in these waters: sea ice, or Arctic pack, which advances from the north during the winter months, and accretion ice, which forms on the vessels themselves as a result of the combination of temperature, wind, and sea spray. The Arctic pack of the Bering Sea is a seasonal phenomenon that reaches its maximum extent between February and March. During those months, it can extend southward to the vicinity of the Pribilof Islands, turning entire sectors of the sea into zones of impossible navigation for vessels that have not been specifically built to operate in ice. But even vessels designed for Arctic waters have limits, and Bering fishing boats, as robust as they may be, are not icebreakers. When the pack advances rapidly, driven by northerly winds, it can surround and trap a vessel before its captain has time to maneuver out. The pressure exerted by compact ice on a steel hull is capable of deforming it and, in extreme cases, of piercing it. The Hillstrand brothers experienced firsthand the moment when the Arctic pack began to surround the Time Bandit near the Pribilof Islands. The sound of ice against the steel hull, they described, is unlike any other sound that can be heard at sea, a deep and continuous grinding that seems to come from everywhere at once, interspersed with sudden blows when a thicker ice flow strikes the hull directly. And as that sound continues, the vessel begins to feel increasingly immobile, more trapped, as if the ocean itself were solidifying around it. The second type of ice, the kind that forms on the vessel itself, is in many ways more dangerous because it acts in an accumulative and silent manner. When air temperature is below zero and there is wind with waves producing spray, seawater freezes on contact with any surface of the deck, equipment, railings, crab pots, cables, and structures. That layer of ice, which begins as a thin film and can reach several centimeters in thickness in a few hours, adds enormous weight to the upper part of the vessel. And since a ship's stability depends largely on the position of its center of gravity, that additional weight aloft has a direct and measurable effect on the vessel's ability to recover from a lateral roll caused by a wave. A typical Bering fishing vessel, with its deck loaded with crab pots weighing about 300 kilograms each, already operates with a high center of gravity under normal conditions. When several centimeters of ice are added over that entire structure, the vessel can become so unstable that a single moderately sized wave is enough to cause a list from which there is no recovery. The history of the Bering Sea is full of cases in which exactly that happened. The response of crews to ice formation on deck involves physically devastating work under extreme cold conditions, equipped with sledgehammers, axes, metal bars, and baseball bats. Sailors must strike the ice without pause to break it and throw it overboard before it accumulates to a critical weight. It is work done at night, with wind and waves, on a slippery deck that is constantly moving, with numb hands inside wet gloves, in temperatures that can be 20 degrees below zero, and it must be done continuously because the ice keeps forming as they work. In the most extreme cases, when the ship accumulates ice faster than the crew can remove it, the only alternative is to attempt to change course toward warmer waters before it is too late. Naval history records dozens of sinkings in the Bering attributable directly to ice accumulation, although the exact cause of each can rarely be determined with certainty because there are no survivors to describe the final minutes. What investigators have been able to reconstruct from the meteorological conditions at the time, the data from the last position tracking, and the load profile of the sunken vessels suggests a recurring pattern. Vessels already operating near the limit of their stability with deckloads of pots, encountering intense icing conditions during the night, when the crew was more exhausted and vigilance was lower, and unable to maintain the pace necessary to prevent critical accumulation. Once the vessel's stability drops below a certain threshold, the process becomes irreversible very quickly. The vessel begins to respond more slowly to each wave. The angle of list increases progressively. Water begins to enter through hatches and bulwarks, and within minutes the situation shifts from concerning to terminal. Survival suits, which Bering fishermen informally call Gumbies because of their resemblance to the well-known animated character, are made of 3 mm thick neoprene and cover the entire body, including hands and head. Properly worn, they can keep a person alive in 4-degree water for several hours, enough time for rescue to arrive if the EPIRB beacon functions correctly and if the Coast Guard can deploy a unit quickly enough. The problem is that correctly putting on a survival suit under emergency conditions, with the vessel listing, in darkness and panic, requires training and repeated practice. Regulations require that the crew be able to do it in less than 60 seconds. In drills, at a calm dock, most can. In a real emergency, in total darkness with the vessel moving violently, that time can triple or quadruple, and the difference between putting on the suit in the cabin and putting it on deck with water up to the knees can be the difference between life and death. Crab fishing in the Bering Sea is, according to statistics from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the job with the highest mortality rate in the entire North American economy. With 141.7 deaths per 100,000 workers per year, it exceeds by nearly 30 times the average mortality rate of an industrial worker. To put it in perspective, working as a crab fisherman in the Bering is, statistically, more lethal than any military occupation in peacetime, more dangerous than underground mining, more deadly than working with high-voltage lines. Since systematic records began, the Bering Sea has claimed more than 2,066 lives. Those figures are not an accident of statistics, nor the product of a single type of catastrophic event. They are the cumulative result of dozens of different ways in which the Bering environment can kill or maim the people who work in it, and of the particular nature of that work, which demands performing physically demanding and technically precise tasks under the most adverse conditions imaginable. To understand how an industry with such a human cost came to be configured, it is necessary to understand the period that Bering fishermen call the Derby, the era of free fishing without individual quotas that dominated the industry from the 1970s to the early 2000s. During the Derby, the king crab season opened at an exact date and time, and any licensed vessel could participate. The entire duration of the season could be as little as 48 to 72 hours, because the Alaska Fisheries Authority closed the season as soon as the cumulative total catch reached the established limit. That meant that hundreds of vessels went out simultaneously to catch as much as they could in the shortest possible time, regardless of weather conditions, without respecting the limits of crew exhaustion and assuming loading and navigation risks that under normal conditions no reasonable captain would have accepted. The economic pressure was so intense that if a vessel decided to remain in port during a storm, it could lose most of its season while competitors filled their holds. The logic of the Derby turned prudence into a luxury that most captains could not afford. The result was a mortality rate that in the worst years of the Derby reached 10 times the current rate. Boats that went out into the Bering in weather conditions that should have kept them in port, overloaded with more pots than their stability allowed, with crews that had gone days without sleep, operated by captains who fully understood the risks they were taking but calculated that the economic reward justified the gamble. Many of them were right. Many others did not return. The typical workday of a crab fisherman during the opilio season, the variety of snow crab fished during the winter months, can extend for 72 consecutive hours without significant rest. This is not an exaggeration or a heroic tale. It is the literal description of what happens when the fleet operates at full capacity. During that period, sailors must handle crab pots weighing between 300 and 400 kilograms, suspended from cranes over decks that tilt and roll with the motion of the sea, in temperatures that can be between 10 and 20 degrees below zero, with salt water freezing on their clothing and gloves as they work. After 40 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to experience hallucinations. Reflexes slow measurably. The ability to assess risks decreases dramatically. And in that state, the sailors must continue handling cables, hooks, and metal pots, all of them potentially lethal if handled with a miscalculation. The pots themselves, the large tubular steel containers covered with nylon mesh that are used to catch crab, represent a specific and well-documented source of danger. A moving pot, suspended from the crane hook while the boat pitches on the swell, can swing with a kinetic energy of up to 30,000 foot-pounds, enough to instantly kill anyone who takes a direct hit. Sailors do not wear steel-toe boots precisely because if a pot were to fall on their foot, the metal plate would act like a blade and cut the foot instead of protecting it. Crushed fingers, broken wrists, and fractured ribs are injuries so common in the Bering fishery that in many cases they are not even considered worth mentioning unless they completely incapacitate the affected person from working. But the most specific and most feared injury of deck work is the one that occurs when a pot line catches a sailor. Each pot is connected to the seabed by a line 3/4 of an inch in diameter, about 400 feet long, coiled on deck before being thrown into the water. When the pot is cast overboard, that line begins to uncoil at high speed. If a sailor, for any reason, puts a foot or a hand into the loop that the line forms at that moment, the force exerted by the pot as it falls toward the seabed is enough to tear off a limb instantly, or to drag the sailor overboard and pull them toward the bottom before anyone on deck can react. This type of accident is referred to in fleet jargon as being dragged by the line, and it is not uncommon. It happens because fatigue reduces attention, because the movement of the vessel can unexpectedly shift a sailor's position, and because the line can snag on clothing or equipment in ways that are impossible to anticipate. The account of Matthew Thiessen, a United States Coast Guard rescue swimmer based in Kodiak, illustrates in a particularly vivid way the nature of the work under those conditions. Thiessen was responsible for rescuing the 4 crew members of the F.V. Hunter, a fishing vessel that sank in the Shelikof Strait during the winter. When the Coast Guard helicopter reached the life raft where the crew were waiting, the rotor icing indicators on the aircraft began to activate with temperatures at 10 degrees below zero. Thiessen entered the water wearing a dry suit, equipped with fins and a climbing harness attached to the hoist cable. The shock of the cold water was immediate. The raft was drifting away, driven by the wind at about 4 knots while Thiessen swam toward it. When he reached it, the 4 crew members showed varying degrees of hypothermia. The captain of the Hunter, in an advanced state of severe hypothermia, had removed his survival suit down to his waist, convinced that he was warm. That is one of the most dangerous symptoms of deep hypothermia. The victim loses the ability to correctly perceive their body temperature and may feel a paradoxical sensation of warmth that leads them to remove clothing, fatally accelerating the cooling process. Thiessen had to make 4 immersions to rescue the 4 crew members while the helicopter disappeared for 15 minutes without explanation, probably because it had to move away from the ice forming on its rotors. During that time, Thiessen was alone in the water, exhausted, with 3 more people needing rescue and without knowing when air support would return. He described that moment as the closest he had come to despair in his career, not because he feared dying himself, but because he feared not having the physical endurance necessary to complete the rescue. The Bering Sea is not only dangerous on its surface. Its underwater topography is also an element that contributes to the complexity of current patterns, and it hosts one of the most extraordinary and, in some respects, most unsettling ecologies on the planet. The Bering Basin has a markedly bipolar geology. The eastern zone, known as the Bering Continental Shelf, is notably shallow. Large expanses of this sea are less than 100 meters deep, making it one of the widest continental shelves in the world. It was precisely in this area that, during the Pleistocene glaciations, sea level dropped enough to expose a strip of land between 1,000 and 1,500 kilometers wide that paleoanthropologists call Beringia. Across that dry land crossed the first groups of Homo sapiens who populated the Americas between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. Today, that same submarine plain is one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world, supporting populations of fish, crustaceans, marine mammals, and birds that rank among the densest in the Northern Hemisphere. West of the shelf, the morphology of the seafloor changes abruptly. The Aleutian Basin drops to depths of nearly 4,000 meters in some areas, and the trench that borders the Aleutian Islands reaches more than 7,000 meters at its deepest point. This transition between the shallow shelf and the deep basin creates particularly intense upwelling currents in which cold, nutrient-rich water from the depths rises to the surface, fueling extraordinary biological productivity. The crab populations that are the target of the Bering fishing fleet predominantly inhabit the continental shelf at depths between 100 and 400 meters. The Bering red king crab, the most valuable species and the one that drove the expansion of the fishing fleet in the 1960s and 1970s, can reach a leg span of nearly 2 meters in the largest specimens, with a weight of up to 10 kilograms. Its blood is blue, composed of hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin, and contains ultra-fast-acting coagulants that allow it to survive injuries that would kill most animals of its size. It lives between 20 and 30 years, migrates up to 100 kilometers annually in dense formations that advance like rolling balls over the sea floor, and inhabits waters whose temperature is equivalent to that of liquid ice. In 1983, the Bering king crab stock collapsed catastrophically. At the peak of the industry, in the early 1980s, the fleet caught more than 170 million kilograms of king crab per year. In 1983, that number dropped by a factor of 10, and the crab biomass took more than 2 decades to begin recovering. Researchers still debate the exact cause of that collapse. Overfishing was undoubtedly a factor, but changes in water temperature, alterations in current patterns related to phenomena such as El Niño, and possibly outbreaks of pathogens affecting populations already weakened by fishing pressure have also been invoked. What became clear is that the Bering, with all its extraordinary biological productivity, is not invulnerable to overexploitation, and that its ecosystems can reach points of no return with unsettling speed. Meanwhile, the chain of Aleutian Islands, which defines the southern boundary of the Bering Sea, is itself one of the most active volcanic arcs on the planet. The Aleutians are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire and contain more than 50 active or potentially active volcanoes. Eruptions in this island chain are relatively frequent, and when they occur, they produce ash plumes that can reach altitudes of more than 15 kilometers and affect transcontinental air routes. In 1946, an earthquake in the Aleutian Trench Zone generated a tsunami that destroyed the Scotch Cap lighthouse on Unimak Island, killing its 5 keepers, and that reached Hilo, in Hawaii, where it caused more than 150 deaths. The history of shipwrecks in the Bering Sea is long and documented with painful precision, because many of the vessels that were lost did so in the presence of other ships that witnessed the sinking without being able to do anything. The Aleutian Harvester, a medium-sized trawler that sank in November 1985 near Augustin Volcano, was seen on the radar of nearby vessels and then simply disappeared from the screen. No survivors were found. There was no flotsam or jetsam, No material debris to confirm that the vessel had existed. Voices on shortwave radio recorded its last transmissions, but even the exact moment of the sinking was impossible to determine because the process must have been almost instantaneous. Jonathan Hillstrand was fishing nearby that night, talking by radio with Danny Martin, one of the Harvester's crew members, when he heard the mayday. Minutes later, there were no more responses. The case of the Big Valley, which sank in January 2005 70 miles from the Pribilof Islands, is better documented because its captain, Cash Seal, survived. The sequence of events illustrates with particular clarity how a sinking occurs in the Bering. The vessel was in the trough between waves of 12 to 15 meters when a rogue wave of 28 meters rolled it 90 degrees in seconds. The lights went out, the generators stopped. The captain, in total darkness, tried to put on his survival suit and reach another crew member who was calling for help. When he reached the deck, the vessel had already rolled another 90 degrees, completely upside down. 2 crew members were thrown into the water with their survival suits in their hands without having been able to put them on. The captain clung to a projection of the hull as the vessel progressively sank. For an hour and a half, he endured in the water while successive waves passed over him. When the vessel finally sank, he had to swim freely to locate a raft by the flash of a strobe. He spent another 30 minutes swimming toward it. The Coast Guard rescued him 2 hours later. He was the only survivor of the 5 crew members. The investigation after the sinking of the Big Valley determined that the probable cause was the phenomenon known as free surface, water moving freely within the vessel's compartments, shifting the center of gravity unpredictably. In the Bering, where the pumps of crab tanks must operate continuously to keep water circulating over the live crustaceans, a pump failure can fill or empty a tank catastrophically in a matter of minutes, dramatically altering the vessel's stability. The combination of that factor with the elevated load of pots on deck and the extreme weather conditions created a sequence of events from which escape was impossible. The wreck of the F.V. Street Patrick in December 1981 is another case that illustrates the cruel paradox that sometimes arises in the Bering. The vessel was a 158-foot trawler with 11 crew members that took on water in the engine room and listed 90 degrees. The crew put on survival suits, tied themselves together, and abandoned ship, terrified that the vessel would roll back over them. 8 of the 11 died of hypothermia or drowning. The 2 survivors were rescued on the verge of death. The tragedy had an epilogue that many described as cruel. The Street Patrick righted itself after the crew abandoned it and was towed to port completely intact. All would have survived if they had remained on board. This dilemma, whether to stay with the vessel or abandon it, is one of the most difficult a crew can face in the Bering, and the history of shipwrecks shows that there is no universally correct answer. In some situations, like that of the Street Patrick, the vessel had more survivability than its crew could perceive from inside a flooded and dark compartment. In others, staying meant going down with the ship. The decision must be made in seconds, with incomplete information, with adrenaline and fear distorting judgment, in an environment where all usual points of reference are gone beneath the water or shrouded in darkness. The most experienced Bering captains speak of this dilemma in terms that reveal how deeply uncertainty is intrinsic. There is no protocol, no rule that guarantees the correct decision. There is only the judgment of the moment, shaped by years of experience and undermined by panic, and the luck that the sea decides to cooperate that day. There is another documented pattern in Bering sinkings that is particularly unsettling, that of vessels that disappear without sending any distress signal, without activating their EPIRB beacon, without anyone on deck having time to reach the radio. That happens when the sinking is so rapid that less than 2 minutes elapse between the first sign of trouble and the total loss of the vessel. Shipwreck investigators call this phenomenon catastrophic sudden sinking, and its most common causes in the Bering are structural failure due to metal fatigue under repeated impact from large waves, explosive flooding of compartments that were supposed to be sealed but whose integrity had deteriorated, or the combination of a sudden list with water in the crab tanks that cannot be redistributed quickly enough. In all those cases, the time between the onset of the problem and the point of no return is too short for any emergency protocol to be carried out. Amid all that atmospheric and oceanic violence, the Bering Sea hosts one of the most extraordinary concentrations of marine life on the planet. The same mix of cold, nutrient-rich waters that makes the sea so dangerous for humans is precisely what creates ideal conditions for some of the most productive food chains in the Northern Hemisphere. The Bering continental shelf produces between 50 and 75 grams of carbon per square meter per year in terms of primary production, placing it among the most productive areas of the global ocean. That level of production sustains massive populations of caplin, herring, Pacific cod, Alaska pollock, and salmon, which in turn feed humpback whales, grey whales, belugas, orcas, sea lions, various species of seals, and an extraordinary diversity of seabirds, including more than 2 million puffins that breed on the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands. This biological abundance is also, in a deep sense, an unresolved mystery. The productivity of the Bering depends on a delicate temporal synchronization between the spring ice melt, which releases nutrients accumulated during the winter, and the arrival of sufficient sunlight to drive phytoplankton photosynthesis. Any disruption of that synchronization, whether due to early or late melting, can collapse the spring plankton bloom on which the entire food chain depends. In years of particularly intense El Niño, that synchronization has been lost, with documented consequences for fish populations and seabird reproduction. Alaska pollock, one of the most economically important species in the Bering, is perhaps the clearest example of that complexity. With catches that in some years exceed 1.5 million tons, Alaska pollock is the most important cold water fishery in the world in terms of volume. Fish sticks, surimi, and frozen fillets consumed in North America, Europe, and Japan come largely from this fish. And yet, its population dynamics show fluctuations that mathematical models still cannot predict accurately. In some years, recruitment, the addition of juveniles to the adult population, is exceptionally high. In others, it collapses, without scientists being able to identify the determining factors with certainty. The Bering is an ecosystem that we understand in general terms, but that continues to resist precise understanding. That unpredictability has direct consequences for the fishing industry, because when stocks decline, vessels must work harder and take greater risks to maintain the profitability of their operations. The collapse of king crab in 1983 produced exactly that dynamic. With less crab available in the usual grounds, captains began to venture farther out, to fish closer to periods of bad weather, to overload their vessels with more pots than was prudent in order to maximize each trip. Fatality statistics reflect that period eloquently. The United States Coast Guard maintains an operational presence in the Bering Sea that is, by the service's standards, extraordinarily demanding. The main bases at Kodiak and Dutch Harbour cover an area of operations of millions of square kilometres under conditions that test the limits of both equipment and the people who operate it. Coast Guard helicopters, primarily the HH-60 Jayhawk and the MH-65 Dolphin, operate in the Bering under weather conditions that other units would consider prohibitive. Rotor icing, which can occur at moderately low temperatures if there is sufficient moisture in the air, is a constant problem that forces pilots to maintain a continuous balance between the urgency of a rescue and the operational safety limits of their aircraft. On more than one occasion, helicopters have had to temporarily abandon a rescue operation to move away from icing conditions, leaving rescue swimmers alone in the water for periods of 10 to 20 minutes. Coast Guard rescue swimmers are probably the most highly trained professionals to operate in the aquatic environment of the Bering. Their training includes months of physical conditioning and technical preparation specific to cold water operations, including the recognition and treatment of hypothermia in the water, helicopter entry and exit techniques in high seas, and triage procedures in multiple rescue situations where available resources are insufficient to save all victims simultaneously. That last aspect, triage in the water, is perhaps the most psychologically difficult part of the job. When a rescue swimmer arrives at the scene of a sinking and there are several people in the water, some conscious and others not, some wearing survival suits and others without them, the available time is limited. Decisions must be made about which individuals have the highest probability of survival with immediate rescue, and action must be taken accordingly, while the cold water simultaneously advances on the rescuer. Bering rescue swimmers describe this process as the aspect of their job that troubles them most when they try to sleep at night. The Coast Guard also operates search and rescue using fixed-wing aircraft, primarily the HC-130 Hercules, which can cover vast areas of the Bering at cruising altitude, searching for activated EPIRB beacons or distress signals. The problem is that, at those altitudes and under the typical visibility conditions in the Bering, detecting a human being in the water is extraordinarily difficult. As one rescuer noted, a human head in the water is no larger than a basketball and can go unnoticed even when the helicopter passes over the area at low altitude. The Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act, passed in 1988 after prolonged resistance from the sector, made it mandatory for fishing vessels to carry life rafts, survival suits, and emergency beacons. Before that law, there were vessels that went out into the Bering without any of those elements, relying exclusively on the skill of their crew and the absence of bad luck. The Coast Guard did not search for the crews of sunken vessels because there was simply no way of knowing where they had disappeared. The fishermen themselves resisted the legislation with the argument that no one should tell them how to do their job, and they were slow to recognize that the new safety requirements were not only reasonable but were directly and measurably saving lives. The response speed of the Coast Guard in the Bering is one of the factors that most directly determines whether someone survives a sinking. Under the most favorable conditions, with a properly functioning beacon, a vessel within the coverage area of the Kodiak base can receive a rescue helicopter in less than 2 hours. But in the more remote areas of the Bering, more than 300 miles from the base, that time can exceed 4 hours. In 4-degree water without a survival suit, 4 hours is a time 4 times greater than it takes for hypothermia to produce unconsciousness. Even with a survival suit, 4 hours in the water in storm conditions subject the body to physical and psychological stress that tests the limits of human endurance in ways that survival statistics cannot fully capture. The cold that penetrates even through neoprene, the continuous movement of the waves, the absolute uncertainty about whether rescue will arrive, the exhaustion that accumulates without any possibility of rest, all of this acts synergistically on the organism and the psyche in a way that survivors consistently describe as the most extreme experience of their lives. There is a psychological dimension to work in the Bering Sea that is as important for understanding its danger as any meteorological and oceanographic data. The cumulative effect of working for weeks and months in an environment where death is a statistically significant possibility, where extreme fatigue is the norm, and where isolation from the outside world is almost total, produces documented psychological and physiological alterations that in turn contribute to increasing the probability of accidents. Sustained sleep deprivation, which is the usual condition of sailors during periods of active fishing, has cognitive effects similar to those of moderate alcohol intoxication. After 17 continuous hours without sleep, cognitive performance is equivalent to that of a person with a blood alcohol level of 0.05 grams per litre. After 24 hours, the equivalent is 0.1 grams, which is the legal limit for driving in most countries. After 48 hours, cognitive deterioration reaches levels that produce visual and auditory hallucinations, severe impairment of judgment, and almost total inability to assess risks realistically. Bering sailors routinely work for 72 hours straight, In that state of extreme exhaustion, the human brain develops a series of compensatory mechanisms that are themselves dangerous. Risk perception decreases, not because individuals are irresponsible, but because the brain circuits responsible for processing threat signals are operating with insufficient cognitive resources. Decisions are made in a more automatic and less deliberative manner. Errors that under normal conditions would be impossible because they go against the most basic common sense become frequent and predictable. The most experienced captains in the Bering are those who have learned to recognize the signs of their own cognitive deterioration and who have established protocols to compensate for it, such as delegating critical decisions to the most rested person on the crew during the final hours of an extended shift. Added to this is the effect of what psychologists call normalization of deviance, the tendency of groups to redefine as acceptable what they originally considered dangerous, after having been repeatedly exposed to that situation without suffering immediate consequences. In the context of the Bering, this means that crews who work at sea for years may come to consider normal meteorological and working conditions that, when evaluated objectively, present clearly unacceptable risks. The sinking of several vessels during the Derby period, the era of free fishing without individual quotas that lasted from the 1970s to the early 2000s, followed patterns that post-mortem investigators identified as direct consequences of this phenomenon. Decisions that seemed reasonable within the cultural context of the fleet, but that from the outside were clearly reckless. The body also pays its own price beyond accidents. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold, even if it does not reach levels of hypothermia, produces cumulative physiological changes. Joints deteriorate more quickly in environments of constant cold and humidity. Arthritis in the knuckles is so common among veterans of Bering fishing that some consider it inevitable. The extremities develop a reduced sensitivity to pain as an adaptation mechanism, which has the perverse consequence that injuries can go unnoticed for longer than would be safe. The immune system is subjected to chronic stress that manifests in higher rates of respiratory infections and in a reduced capacity to recover from physical trauma. The Bering Sea has an additional dimension of danger that operates invisibly from the surface, but can determine the fate of a vessel as much as the wind or the waves, its ocean currents, that form a complex system and still partly poorly understood system of water flows that interact in ways that numerical models can only reproduce approximately. The main component of Bering circulation is the flow of water from the North Pacific into the Arctic through the Bering Strait. Approximately 1 million cubic meters of water per second flow northward through this strait, making the Bering one of the most important ocean corridors on the planet in terms of transport of heat and nutrients between ocean basins. That flow interacts with the tides, which in some areas of the Bering Shelf can reach amplitudes of up to 6 meters, generating tidal currents that can reach several knots even in the absence of wind. In the Shelikof Strait, the passage of water that separates the Alaska Peninsula from the Kodiak Islands and that acts as one of the access routes to the fishing waters of the Gulf of Alaska. This interaction between ocean currents, tides, and submarine relief creates what Captain James Cook, in his exploration of those waters in the late 18th century, described as the second worst weather in the world after Cape Horn. Currents coming from 4 different directions converge at that point, from Kennedy Entrance, from Cook Inlet, from Kachemak Bay, and from the Gulf of Alaska. The tides generate rips of unpredictable speed, and the funnel effect of the strait amplifies wind speed in a manner analogous to what occurs in the Bering Sea itself. The waves that form in that configuration are irregular, short, and steep, which makes them especially dangerous for fishing vessels attempting to cross it. The interaction of currents with submarine topography also creates a series of eddies and upwelling zones of deep water that have direct consequences both for crab distribution and for navigational safety. Some of these eddies are large coherent structures that persist for weeks or months and that can trap small vessels on their periphery, generating cross-sea conditions that are particularly difficult to handle. Others are ephemeral and local, generated by the interaction of tidal flow with some irregularity of the seabed, and can appear without warning in areas that minutes earlier seemed perfectly calm. Satellite monitoring of Bering currents, which began to develop systematically in the 1990s with the deployment of radar altimeters aboard oceanographic satellites, has considerably improved the capacity to predict those currents, but it is still insufficient to provide real-time information with the spatial resolution necessary for the navigation of fishing vessels. Bering captains still depend to a great extent on their accumulated experience and on the information they exchange by radio to navigate those currents, which means that knowledge of the behavior of local waters remains an essential component of safety. There is also a specific phenomenon of the Bering that fishermen know well, although oceanographic science only partially understands it: the appearance of rips or traction currents. In shallow shelf areas where the interaction between tide, wind, and seabed topography creates zones of rapidly moving and turbulent water that can appear within minutes and disappear just as quickly. A rip of moderate intensity can reach speeds of 4 or 5 knots, enough to render a small vessel unmanageable or to drag a sailor who has fallen into the water far from any possibility of quick rescue. In areas with large tidal ranges, such as those adjacent to the Bering Strait itself, rips can reach even greater speeds and generate, when they interact with the wind, a sea of short wavelength but great steepness that some experienced mariners describe as more difficult to handle than a conventional storm, because the motion is chaotic and unpredictable instead of having the certain regularity that even the great storms of the Bering present. Night navigation in the Bering adds an additional dimension to all these dangers. During the winter months, hours of darkness far exceed those of light at these latitudes, and fishing is carried out continuously, regardless of the solar cycle. In conditions of total darkness, with snow or hail reducing visibility to practically zero, with radar as the only tool to detect other vessels or masses of ice, captains navigate in an environment where their direct senses are almost completely useless, and where reliance on electronic instruments must be total, despite the fact that those instruments can also fail. Fog banks, frequent in the Bering during certain times of the year when warm, moist air from the Pacific comes into contact with the cold water of the shelf, can reduce visibility to less than 10 meters, even in relatively calm sea conditions, creating situations where vessels navigating in formation or approaching fishing grounds can find themselves at dangerously short distances before anyone has time to react. The Bering Sea is changing, not in a dramatic or visible way to the untrained eye, but through gradual yet cumulative transformations that researchers have been documenting for 2 decades, and that, in recent years, have accelerated in a worrying manner. Water temperature in the Bering has increased measurably since the 1970s, with most of the warming concentrated in the last 2 decades. In the winters of 2018 and 2019, unprecedented water temperatures were recorded in the historical records, accompanied by extraordinarily reduced sea ice coverage. The winter of 2018 was the first in decades in which large areas of the Bering continental shelf that are normally covered by ice for months remained open throughout the entire cold season. The consequences of that reduction in sea ice for the Bering ecosystem are profound and partly unexpected. Spring sea ice is the substrate on which ice algae develop, a specialized form of phytoplankton that grows on the underside of the ice, and that represents the base of the Arctic food chain. When the ice disappears earlier than usual, that ice algae cannot complete its life cycle, and the organic matter that it normally deposits on the sea floor when the ice melts, which feeds benthic invertebrate populations, simply does not arrive. The consequences propagate upward in the trophic chain in ways that ecological models still cannot predict with certainty. What can already be documented is the northward displacement of species. Several species of fish from warmer waters have extended their range into waters that were previously too cold for them, At the same time, some Arctic species that depend on sea ice to reproduce, such as the Opilio snow crab, have seen the spatial distribution of their populations change in ways that complicate fishing. Fishermen who for decades knew the hotspots, where to find crab each season, are discovering that those places are no longer as reliable as before. For the fishing fleet, this means changes in operational patterns that imply, in many cases, venturing farther into deeper waters or farther from home ports, which in turn implies greater exposure to adverse weather conditions and longer response times in case of emergency. The paradox is that the warming of the Bering, which might be thought to make conditions more benign by reducing ice, can, in fact, increase the danger of fishing by forcing vessels to operate farther from the coast in search of a resource that is shifting. Marine permafrost, which is the frozen sediment that covers large areas of the shallow Bering seabed, is thawing in response to warming water. That thawing releases methane accumulated over millennia in the form of gas hydrates, bubbles of this potent greenhouse gas that rise to the surface and in turn contribute to global warming in a feedback cycle whose final magnitude scientists are still debating. From the standpoint of navigation, areas where massive methane release occurs present a specific hazard. Water, saturated with gas bubbles, has a lower density than normal water, which means that vessels navigating over those areas can experience a sudden loss of buoyancy, a phenomenon documented in simulations and in some incidents in other parts of the world. There is something about the Bering Sea that exceeds the sum of its documented dangers and its mortality statistics, a quality that fishermen and navigators who know it try to describe in various ways, but that almost invariably escapes precise description. A presence, a sensation of being in a place where the usual categories of scale and time do not apply in the same way. The Bering has a temporal depth that distinguishes it from the environments where humans usually live. Its seabed holds the remains of Beringia, the submerged continent that connected two worlds and was the migration route that populated a hemisphere. The sediments of its shelf contain climatic records that go back millions of years, layers of information about glaciations, interglaciations, and ocean changes that paleoceanographers are only beginning to decipher. Its deepest waters harbour biological communities that live in a perpetual winter of 4 degrees, in total darkness, subjected to pressures of several hundred atmospheres, in conditions that at the surface would be immediately lethal to any complex organism, and yet developing forms of life, of bewildering sophistication and diversity. The creatures that inhabit the bottom of the Bering are of a strangeness that seems designed to subvert conventional biological categories. Giant Pacific octopuses, which can reach spans of 4 meters, exhibit behaviors that cognitive biologists classify as genuinely intelligent. They are capable of learning, solving complex problems, and communicating through coloration patterns that we still do not fully understand. Jellyfish of the species Cyanea capillata, known as the lion's mane jellyfish, can reach a diameter of 2 meters with tentacles more than 30 meters long, making them the longest animals on the planet. In the deepest zones, around hydrothermal vents, there exist entire ecosystems that do not depend at all on solar energy, sustained by chemoautotrophic bacteria that obtain energy from sulfur compounds that emerge from the volcanic seabed. Bering fishermen themselves develop over time a relationship with the sea that incorporates elements that in other contexts would sound strange. Jonathan Hillstrand describes how, after decades fishing in the Bering, he understood that he could never truly claim to understand it. The sea has its own rules, its own times, its own logic that is not always accessible to human rationality. Mariners who respect that opacity, who accept that there are things the sea does that simply happen without being able to be anticipated or fully explained, tend to be those who survive the longest in it. The fauna of the Bering also has a dimension that does not appear in tourist guides or conventional nature documentaries. stellar sea lions, which can reach 300 kilograms in adult males and that gather in large groups on the rocky reefs of the Aleutians and the Pribilofs, are animals of a power and unpredictability that surprises those who observe them for the first time near the water. They have attacked divers and sailors who have approached their groups too closely, and their speed in the water far exceeds that of any human being. Orcas, which form permanent pods in Bering waters, exhibit coordinated hunting behaviors of a sophistication that ethologists are still characterizing, groups specialized in certain types of prey, intentional stranding techniques to capture seals on shore, use of active echolocation to coordinate hunting maneuvers at distances that exceed visibility. Their presence around fishing grounds is frequent, and although direct attacks on vessels are extremely rare, fishermen regard them with the same mixture of fascination and cautious respect that any predator of that size in its natural element deserves. The Bering Strait, which gives the sea its name, is only 85 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, between Cape Prince of Wales in Alaska and Cape Dezhnev in Siberia. From the mainland on a clear day, the opposite shore can be seen. Two cultures, two continents, separated by a corridor of water that, at its deepest point, does not exceed 55 meters. That strait is the hinge between the Arctic Ocean and the Bering Sea, the point where Pacific currents move northward and Arctic waters mix with temperate ones, where temperature and salinity contrasts generate oceanographic conditions that scientists are still mapping in detail. In that strait are also the Diomede Islands, two small landmasses separated by barely 4 kilometers of water. Big Diomede belongs to Russia, Little Diomede to the United States. Between them runs the international date line, so that the two islands, visible from one another on clear days, are technically on different calendar days. During the Cold War, those 4 miles of grey, cold water were the most tense frontier in the world in terms of physical proximity between the two superpowers. A place where military pilots and sailors on both sides observed each other from distances that, in any other geopolitical context, would have been impossible. The native inhabitants of both islands, who had maintained commercial and family relations for centuries, were abruptly separated by the Arctic Iron Curtain and could not visit one another for decades. The Bering Sea, in that sense, is not only a setting of natural dangers, it is also a political frontier that has defined and divided human lives in ways that the cold of the water and the force of the wind alone cannot explain. Passage through that strait has been traversed by humans for 15,000 years, from the first groups that crossed on foot, over ice or in primitive vessels, to the European explorers who mapped it in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the cargo ships and fishing vessels that transit it today. Each of those crossings has been an act of negotiation with a sea that does not negotiate. The Bering does not yield nor adapt to human needs. It is the human being who must adapt to it, and those who do not pay the price that statistics record with a coldness analogous to that of the sea itself. That is the nature of the Bering Sea, not a dramatic adversary that announces its power, nor a malevolently oriented force of destruction, but something more indifferent and therefore more terrifying. A system of natural forces on a planetary scale that operates according to its own laws, that generates its own beauties and its own extraordinary ecologies, and that tolerates human presence within strict parameters that those who work in it learn to understand with their bodies, and over time, not with the certainty of having mastered them, but with the humility of one who knows that learning never ends.